I'm Scott. This is Antiwar Radio, and the spotlight article today on Antiwar.com is War, Who Decides? It's by Doug Bandow. He's the Robert A. Taft Fellow at the American Conservative Defense Alliance and author of Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. He writes Foreign Follies for us at Antiwar.com. Welcome back to the show, Doug.
Happy to be on.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. And this is a very interesting question for all kinds of timely reasons today. Who decides about war? Of course, all of us learn in 5th grade that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 gives the exclusive power to declare war to the Congress, not to the President, and for specific reasons relating to the Revolutionary War, which had ended just a few years before. Isn't that right?
That's right. No, the founders of the American Republic believed that they were founding a republic, not a monarchy. And they had seen, they'd just kind of escaped a system where one man, the monarch, the king, could take an entire empire into war. And they made it very clear that what they were doing is transferring that power to several people as opposed to one. They thought you put it into Congress, you have two different houses that have to vote on it. Now you force a public debate, you force an agreement of a lot of people. They were quite explicit. They wanted to slow down the process to war. They'd seen the other side. They didn't like it.
Well, and we've seen what happens when Congress, which hasn't declared war since 1941 in the declaration of war against Japan and Germany there, we see what happens when they don't declare war. A lot of times they pass these authorizations for the president to decide. But then whenever things go wrong, they say, well, but the president decided, and they've quite literally given their responsibility away, and they seem to be able to get away with doing that.
Well, that's right. The problem is on both sides. You have presidents who want to, take the power into their own hands, and then you have Congresses that won't defend, the Constitution. And I think you're absolutely right. Congress likes the idea of not being responsible. So you let the president make a hard decision. If it goes well, you applaud him. If it goes badly, then you can complain and carp, and that's kind of where the Democrats are today. Many of them, of course, supported Bush on authorizing Iraq, and now they're upset the way it's turned out. But we never really had Congress take control because, they passed authority off. They say, well, you can decide, certain things. They got the same thing after 9/11. We've seen that in other situations. So even when they vote, and it's good at least that they vote, but even when they vote, they try to pass off responsibility. That's not what the founders intended.
What's funny is they're now in the position where you have, like Senator Webb from Virginia there introduced a resolution. There was a similar one in the House of Representatives, a rider onto a defense appropriations bill that simply reminded the president that he does not have the authority to start a war, and the Democrat leadership took it out.
Well, that's right, because, let's face it, there are a lot of issues when you start getting into Iran, a lot of political groups out there. Again, even on something like that, this should be clear enough. They hate to have that responsibility. And, from their standpoint, far better off let somebody else take the heat. They can pose, they can give a speech, but when it comes down to actually taking up the tough job of voting yes or no on these issues, they'd prefer not to do it.
Yeah, and now this is also timely because just yesterday, Attorney General Mukasey came out and said that he would like Congress to actually declare war against Al-Qaeda. And now there are a lot of implications of that we could get into, but I'm curious because I remember after September 11th, Ron Paul introduced a resolution to put basically bounty hunters' mark on their heads, a letter of marque and reprisal like Jabba the Hutt and Han Solo kind of thing going on there. And because they're a stateless group, they're less than a state. Declarations of war are for states. These guys are pirates.
It's a very odd idea to declare war against a group. I guess it makes a bit more sense than claiming you're at war against, a technique like terrorism. The problem with that was always like we're going to be going to war against artillery or something.
Yeah, right, but that's not saying much. Exactly.
No, that's right. It at least it makes somewhat more sense, but you're right. We traditionally think of war between nation states. The idea of a war against a group, what on earth does that mean? My fear here is, basically it's viewed as a technique to get around recent Supreme Court rulings. In terms of, question of Guantanamo Bay, habeas corpus, terming people to be enemy combatants. This administration has claimed extraordinary power based on the being, the commander-in-chief and arguing that they've argued that during wartime the president's power as commander-in-chief swallows the rest of the Constitution, that he can deny an American citizen arrested in America access to the courts, simply because the president decides to term him an enemy combatant. So my guess is that since they haven't been doing terribly well in the courts, this is the way that Mukazi thinks they can kind of seize the initiative again. If you declare war against Al-Qaeda, then presumably that means America is the battleground, and it's an unending war, which means the president can make these kinds of decisions forever. I mean, I think a very dangerous step he's proposing.
I've always been curious about the limits of the war power, if there are any. I read something that I believe was written before the Bush administration and the unitary executive theory coming into prominence on the part of, the war party types. And it was an article by Joe Stromberg for LouRockwell.com called In Search of the Elusive War Power. And I think in there he concludes, kind of begrudgingly that it seems like once you have a declaration of war, all statutes are off. The president basically can do whatever he wants at that point. He could ultimately destroy all life and property within the state in order to protect the state.
Well, yeah, there's always an argument for necessity, but at least in theory, if you're dealing with constitutional rights and the law is written by Congress, that necessity has to be pretty obvious. That what this administration has essentially claimed, and I mean, and that this guy, I guess, what Stromberg's kind of alluding to is that if you say we are in a war, then all bets are off. Essentially, that means I can do anything. And but that's something which, in many ways, is very new. I mean, there's certainly been exertions of presidential power, by Roosevelt, by Truman, by Woodrow Wilson. But this administration, for example, the claim that you can arrest an American citizen in America and designate them an enemy combatant and imprison them without access to the courts or to attorneys is really a step beyond anything we've seen before. There was a case in World War II, German saboteurs showed up on in the United States. One of them, I guess, technically was an American citizen. But these guys were, in an armed conflict representing the other side. I mean, it was a very different kind of circumstance. So this administration, I think, is pushing it further. There is an argument that can be made. I don't think it's a very good argument, but in today's environment, if Congress won't defend the Constitution, you're up to the courts, and courts hate to get involved in these kind of political controversies during an alleged wartime.
Right, so Dayward 10, in fact, this is something I've always been pleasantly surprised when the Supreme Court has issued in favor of the Constitution and the law in the Rasul case, the Hamdan case, and the Boumediene case, because I was so worried that, well, it's up to these guys, just like you say, they don't want to get involved in controversies like this, try to avoid it as often as they can. They ducked the Padilla case once on a technicality and kind of a silly one in order to not have to rule on it. And I'm worried that it comes down to these 9 judges, and, well, more than half of them are detestable creatures up there. I don't trust them to decide the right thing. I'm, like I said, happily surprised when they do the right thing.
No, I think you're right. I think one of the reasons they've done what they've done is because no one else is stepping up to the plate. That it's clear if the Republican Congress is willing to let Bush do anything that he wanted, that the rest of the Constitution kind of be damned. If the partisan comity, we all have to be nice to our fellow Republican. But then it turns out the Democrats aren't that good. I mean, the Democrats here are, unfortunately, hesitant to criticize the president on this. They don't want to be held vulnerable. And so you would think that Nancy Pelosi and company, having taken control, would move the other direction, but they've been awful. I mean, things like FISA, where they've basically kind of ratified what the administration wanted. They've avoided any suits for, law breaking by private companies. I mean, it's an extraordinary record. And you're right. And you're left simply relying on the courts and expecting these guys to be willing to take those tough steps, in the face of kind of a political system that won't respond. That's hard, and we've been lucky, but there's no guarantee it'll continue.
Now, the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which the Democrats also supported, which, like the FISA amendments, basically is just going back and rubber stamping the laws that Bush had been breaking. Doesn't it take care of all this? What's all this about? We need a declaration of war and even more laws establishing procedures here and all that.
Well, I think the problem there is that from an administration standpoint, that still involves Congress. So they couldn't get everything they wanted. I think Mukazi and company, and certainly the president and the vice president, they want a world in which every decision is made by the president. I mean, they're horrified by even this modest accountability